Hi, everyone. Today we'll be focusing on the institution of the family again, specifically looking at the intersection of race and gender and how that ties into the institution of family and family life. Before we get there, just a brief recap of what we've been doing so far in the institutional foundations of gender section of the class. We looked at marriage and family as social institutions, and we broke the institutions down in three different ways. First, we said the institution is gendered, and by a gendered institution, we're looking at the division of labor, roles and responsibilities associated with the sexes. And basically here we're looking at different chores, different tasks that we label for her or for him. Then we say the institution is also gendering in the sense that it provides spaces of gender socialization. We enter the gendered institution, and through the socialization process, we become socialized as men and as women. So the gendering goes on directly through the performance of the task and indirectly through observing others perform the different tasks and responsibilities. And then we say that the institution can be seen as promoting inequality between the sexes. So the organization, the gendering process together contribute to the separation and the stratification of the sexes. And I said it's important to recognize that when we're looking at a gender division of labor, is it there by choice or is it there due to social structural forces? If it's there by choice, then I think we can be okay with the inequalities that emerge as a result. It's okay for people to choose, their own roles and responsibilities if given the choice. And then the inequality that comes with that is something that we should be okay with. But when the gender organization and the gender separation is not done by choice, then we can say here is that false inequality, not based upon anything real, merit wise, or a result of anybody's personal choice through agency. So we start to see that structural forces in society, such as institutional arrangements, cultural expectations, they contribute to disparities when it comes to power in the family, status, time, and responsibility, and overall kind of blames when you look at women and men. So that's just a quick recap of kind of what we did with the institutions of marriage and family. And today we'll continue to look at the family and how gender and race come together to influence parenting ways. When looking at the Dow article for today, we can recognize how it links all three of our course dimensions together. But what I'll do is kind of look at them in terms of how culture shapes social psychology, which in turn will shape different parenting practices. So we can say that our culture has different racialized meanings a part of it. So the external cultural force we're exposed to carries within it different meanings we associate with different racial categories. And once we're exposed to those racialized meanings, we learn them, basically learning racial stereotypes. And that can influence what goes on within the institution of the family, specifically when people learn different racialized meanings, and then they will kind of use those meanings to guide their parenting practices. What I'll be doing is breaking down the article for today in reference to the in-class assignment. So basically, if you're looking at the in-class assignments and kind of following along, you'll see how the two will kind of match up with each other. So beginning to break down the article, we're looking at the intersection primarily of gender and race. So, how ideas of masculinity intersects with ideas of race. But there's a third variable that's being talked about a little bit, and it's the variable of class. And so we'll get into why class is a part of the conversation in a little bit. But basically, we're looking at how African American boys are stigmatized to much higher degrees compared to boys from other racial categories, and also compared to African American girls. So, the article talks about how the African American parent will parent differently, kind of based upon if the sex is a male or female, but they also are very conscious of the different meanings that society attached to the African American boy. So it's just not trying to raise, boy and girl differently, like a lot of families will try to do. But again, it's kind of those racialized meanings, kind of a stigmatization that's often attached to African American boys that the parent is aware of that will influence how they raise their kids. So when looking at those three variables again, we can say that race kind of outweighs class and gender. So you start to see how race again is very important because African Americans as a racial category have been defined compared to other racial categories as more potentially dangerous and more potentially violent and so on and so on. So these meanings attached to the racial category, being an African American, really kind of come to the forefront as making that kind of a dominant variable within the research. But again, gender does matter as well here because it's going to be different meanings we attach to the African American boy compared to the African American girl. And parents will use various strategies to parent their African American sons. So that's what the article really starts to get into, these 4 different management strategies that are employed by the African American parent to raise their sons. And here, just kind of a reminder that we're not saying that the parents believe or the parents endorse these stereotypes, but the parents are aware of them. So even though the parents don't believe the stereotypes, they know their kid, isn't aggressive, they know the kid is not violent, but they do recognize that other people who don't know their kid may be kind of seeing them and interacting with them based upon the stereotypes rather than kind of interacting with them and seeing them as who they really are. So the parents don't believe the stereotypes, but they recognize that they're still out there, thus they'll use those stereotypes to influence their parenting practices. We can first look at the strategies of managing experience and managing environment. So when managing experience, basically the parents are trying to manage the different experiences that the kids go through directly or indirectly, or different experiences that the kids could potentially go through in the future. So the parents teach the sons different class-based and race-based cultures. So here's where the variable of class comes into play, because the parents are worried that kind of coming from a middle-class background, the African American boys are kind of exposed to a one-dimensional, sometimes whitish middle-class culture. And so the parents want to expose their sons to other types of culture related to different class backgrounds and also different class backgrounds. In other words, the parent wants a kid to recognize that just because maybe them as an African American boy or perhaps their friends as African American boys don't have the same experiences being part of the middle class that African American boys have when they're part of a working or perhaps lower class. And just kind of carry that awareness with them. So if they ever kind of find themselves in a different situation, they would kind of know how to act, kind of know how to think based upon the new culture in which they find themselves kind of out of their middle class culture bubble, so to speak. And then the parents want to teach their kid different versions of masculinity. The parents worry about how popular culture often provides African American men, African American boys, a very kind of one dimensional view of black masculinity. Often it's tied into playing sports, being athletes. Often it's tied into performing music, being part of the music industry. So you see kind of these one dimensional, perhaps two dimensional versions of African American males out there in popular culture. But the parents, they want their kids to recognize that there are other kind of versions of African American masculinity, whether it be in politics, whether it be in academics and science. Again, it's kind of recognizing that there are other individuals you could perhaps look up to and mimic besides athletes and besides musicians. So now we can turn our attention to another strategy, the managing the environment. So the parents try to keep their sons in familiar settings. And here the trick is the more people are familiar with your kid, the less they're going to be using any type of stereotype to understand them, to interact with them, because they know your kid for who your kid really is. Thus, your kid's race is not going to interfere with how people see you, with how people judge you. But when your kid is in more unfamiliar settings where people don't know them, here is where the likelihood increases that people will be using stereotypes to understand your kid, seeing your kid as the black kid rather than, Ryan or, whatever the name is of the kid. So another strategy within the managing environment technique is you try to keep your kid indoors. So basically, it's more, you can say it's easier to monitor. It's more of a peace of mind to have your kid in an indoor space that you can actually control to larger degrees compared to when your kid's in outdoor spaces. There's a lot more there's a larger degree of something happening that's out of your control. And again, when a kid's outdoors compared to indoors, it's not as easier to watch over, not as easy to monitor. So basically, it's all about kind of protecting the kid and the kid getting in some type of trouble by no fault of their own perhaps. But you can look over your kid much easier when their kid's indoors, and you don't have to worry about your kid as much when the kid is in familiar settings. So we can turn our attention to two other strategies, managing the image and managing the emotions of the African American son. So the parent tries to employ the image management by trying to control the impression that the kid may be giving off to other people, intentionally or not. The parent is concerned that the impression that the kid gives off at school, outside of school, may be giving off a wrong impression and perhaps reinforcing the negative stereotypes that are often attached to the African American male. So, in managing the image, parents will practice different role playing scenarios with their kids. So basically, they want to make sure their kid knows kind of what to do and how to do it in a certain given situation. So whether it be kind of interacting with one's teacher, interacting with a police officer, or any type of authority figure, the parent wants the kid to kind of understand the situation and kind of what they need to do, or perhaps what they don't need to do in those situations to make sure that everything goes smoothly as possible. And again, you start to see the connection between kind of race and gender here, where, a parent that's parenting a white kid, a white male, it doesn't really have to kind of think of these things, that maybe the officer or the teacher is going to be treating my kid differently based upon him being a white male. So also we can look at how the parent tries to manage the kid's behavior, what they wear in terms of their clothing, and their language use. So again, it's all about impression management. The parent is worried about the kid giving off the wrong impression by acting in a certain way, wearing certain types of clothing, or perhaps using a certain type of jargon, a certain type of slang. And so they try to manage these things, the behavior, the clothing, and the language. So again, not to give off the wrong impression, perhaps not to reinforce any negative stereotypes that can potentially be harmful for the kid in various social situations. So finally, we can turn attention to managing emotions. So here, the parent basically tries to teach their son to not express kind of negative emotions such as anger, hostility, aggression, because the concern of the parent is that often when it's an African American male expressing the anger, hostility, the aggression, it's seen as being kind of hyper emotional. So, in other words, if somebody such as a white male or an Asian male is raising his voice, getting angry, they'll be looked at as somebody who is being, somebody who is upset. But when it's an African American male, sometimes the same type of behavior is seen as being kind of hyper emotional. So here the parent is trying to kind of manage the kid's emotions by saying, don't make sure you're not displaying these negative emotions, out in public settings, in settings where people really don't know you, because they could misinterpret the situation and make it much worse than it really is. So just to leave it there and kind of think about this breakdown in reference not only to the article, in reference not only to looking at how the institution of the family relates to gender and how there's a racial variable that intersects with it, but also recognize how this all ties into your in-class assignment.